the first thing that I had to learn as a coach was like, there are so many ways of being great in sport and in life that I have to foster the environment and I have to encourage these kids to figure that out on their own. Like that's part of life is figuring out what makes you great.
Welcome to Iron Summit, where we cover topics about health, fitness, and general performance through the eyes of former elite Division I wrestlers.
All right, guys. Our guest today, Hayden Hidlay, five-time All-American. Not very many people that can say that. And currently coaching at Stanford. Hayden, what's up, man?
Oh, nothing much. We're just getting a few guys ready for the non-Olympic World Team Trials coming up in a few weeks. It's kind of like a one of the few like breather time periods I think in college wrestling coach lifestyle. So kind of have a couple weeks here where it's not a ton going on, but there's something going on, but it's not crazy. So kind of taking advantage of that over the next few weeks until, the recruiting swing picks up and then, you know, you're pretty much locked in for a few months after that.
Absolutely. It is weird. Like there's that 1 month, basically like August even in college where you're like, that's like your only kind of downtime. Um, but yeah, no, it's, has anybody been asking, are you going out for 70 kilos World Team Trials?
No. So like a couple of the guys on the team actually like the other day, they're like, hey, I just saw the news like that you're wrestling at World Team Trials at 70. I was like, it's not like that's the first I've heard of it. And like I kind of had flashbacks like how much like dedication and like how much planning out it took for me to like make 70 kilograms. And I
Right.
had like a internal fear. I'm like, why am I feeling this way when I had no plans of actually wrestling at this tournament? But they were just playing a joke on me. So it
Oh,
was
that's funny.
kind of funny. Yeah, no, I don't have any plans on competing. Kind of dealing with some knee issues right now, but also like kind of really rounding into form with the whole coaching lifestyle. And like, I think after competing and knowing how much effort it takes to do that, I feel like I would be kind of not as good at two jobs if I tried to do that compared
Sure.
to like, you want to be great at doing the job that you're here for. So yeah, no, I don't really have any plans for that, but it was kind of funny. The guys on the team, like they had me like almost believe for a second that I was actually wrestling in this tournament.
What do you
Well, it
walk
is.
then, weight wise?
So my weight has kind of fluctuated quite a bit over the last few years. In between years 5 and 6 for me, I decided to move from 57 to 74. There's kind of a lot that went into that. But I was kind of at the point at 57 where I had I got fifth place at 2021 NCAAs and I felt like I was hanging on by a thread. That was like even a shortened season and my weight cuts were pretty tough. I had to get a couple surgeries after that year. And so I kind of was really hesitant to come back for a 6th year, unless it was a lot of things had to change. I just looked at it like, I don't know if I could go through a full season and still have good results. And, fifth place is like nothing to be like ashamed of. It's just, I knew that I wasn't at like a high performance for me internally, like with my standard of performance. And so I kind of changed things up entirely. After I recovered from mouth surgery and knee surgery, I just kind of went to work in determining like what is the best option for me and my team to like have finish out on good terms and like have performance where I don't have regrets. And so I looked at either 65 or 74 and 65 like was something that probably would have made a lot of sense. There was some like, some team aspects of it, where like our 65 pounder, it would have been much harder for him to bump up to 74. And so for me to bump up to 74, it actually wasn't that much of a challenge. And so I kind of looked at it as like, hey, I can wrestle up at 74. I can wrestle back to back with my brother, and train with him a lot. And so that was kind of like the decision matrix for me. Like, I really didn't look at the landscape of who all was in that weight, which it turned out to be like a really crazy weight class that year with, Makai Lewis, Kemmerer, Starachi ended up winning. Um, and then there was, me, Massa, Dustin Plott, Clay Lout. And so it was really crazy, especially within the ACC. And so I kind of looked at that as like huge challenge and was like, whatever. I'm in year 6. Like, what do I have to lose at this point? I've already tried my hand at 57 and it's kind of really hurting me in the long run. And so I just kind of changed up a lot of the things that I was doing. And so long story short, whenever I did that, I got up to like the low 80s. And so I was kind of walking around like 182, 180 as the year kind of went on. It was harder to maintain that, but I was still, high 70s, wrestling pretty naturally at 74. And then after that, I stopped wrestling and got into coaching at NC State, and I started to lose weight quite a bit for whatever reason. I think it was just because my training at 74, I was just lifting a ton and I was really healthy and just, once I stopped like feeling the need to lift like a maniac, I started to drop some weight. I was wrestling a lot still just as a coach. But I also like wasn't weighing in either. And so for whatever reason, I ended up kind of dropping some weight and I was lower than what I was when I was wrestling 57. So like got down to like low 70s. And I was thinking to myself, like, man, I really wish I had these numbers when I was making 57. And so later on that year, I ended up wrestling at 70 kilos, which is like 154 and a half.
Yeah.
And that was easier though than my cuts for 57 because I had a long period of time to plan it out. And so I
Yeah.
would say like 2 months in advance, like I had a schedule for what I wanted to weigh out at each day and wake up at each morning with some like little grace windows. And so I was really like, dialed in on that. It was a much easier cut just because I had a ton of time and at that point was probably a lot smarter in terms of the nutrition, what I need to be doing with my body. But, um, then after that, I've kind of, you know, been around the low 70s, range. And that's kind of just like, coaching lifestyle. That's what I would say I'd like to be at. I'd like to stay here and still be very healthy enough to wrestle with the guys in the team and be at a really good weight to wrestle with a lot of different people. And so that's kind of where I flatlined out at the last year or so is kind of being in the low 70s range.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I was thinking about it the other day. It seems like your junior year of college is probably your like best year in terms of your body being healthy, having some years under your belt with college seasons and stuff like that. But I think a D1 season is so unforgiving that those weight cuts catch up to you. And when you look back at it, like most of the guys that take, fifth, sixth, seventh, sometimes eighth years, they usually did a lot better like a couple years before that. Um, so it's like good for you to recognize that pattern and like be able to go up and do that because I think a lot of guys just try to keep grinding the axe and it's like they get hurt, they're not wrestling well. And like also selflessly doing it for the team, not going just one weight class up 2 weight classes. Was that a big jump for you in terms of like, I mean, obviously every weight class is a little bit different of a feel. But I'm sure your maybe like top writing was a lot different at 74. Like how different was that for you going from 57 to 74?
Yeah, it was different for sure. I think there were some huge positives, and then there was a couple where I felt like was a pretty big negative. So it wasn't. I would say it wasn't until like I wrestled guys like Makai Lewis or Starachi where I felt a little bit like how do I put it? Like whenever I was wrestling with them, I knew for sure that I was not as big as these guys. Like probably, in the week leading up to it, I might have weighed the same come weigh in time, but I knew
Yeah.
while wrestling, I was like, all right, this is a little bit different. But I think I was able to kind of overcome some of that just because at 57, I was just really strong. I was probably one of the stronger guys in that weight. And so when I went up to 74, those guys, like for sure, I wasn't like the strongest guy, but I was still probably right around where I needed to be competitive. And so then I kind of had some advantages with just, I felt a lot faster. I felt like my conditioning was really good there. Um, and I think I just like, there is a little bit of a difference in some of the wrestling from 57 to 74. I felt like I was able to carry that with me. I would say the really only drawbacks was I felt a little bit outclassed by some of those guys that have been at that weight for a long time and were huge. Um, but really at the end of the day, it was, I had a great year and had pretty good results throughout. It was just a different, I think, style of wrestling. And in terms of like the top wrestling, that was interesting. You mentioned that, like, I think as my career went on, I became much better at top, just in terms of being able to get turns and being able to ride. And so that became a little bit harder at 74. I think just with, um, honestly, the guys sweat more. That's something you don't really like think about. But in the third period is a little bit harder, but I actually became much better at riding, throughout my career. And so it kind of kept on with that trend at 74. But yeah, there were some, some positives, some negatives, but I think like overall, it was really the thing that refreshed my mind the most. Like I had a new challenge to overcome and I had a new set of training that I was doing in year 6. And I think looking back at these last few years with the, guys getting extra years and some guys have gone one way, for example, yourself, like you finished out on a really high note. And then you have some other guys that are like limping to the finish line. And I didn't really want to be a part of that second group of guys. Um, and so, finished out with third in my last year. It was a different challenge and, you know, it it really refreshed my career, I think, and just, you know, finishing out and going all in on something that was a little different, but being completely healthy, and that was a huge win for me for sure.
What do you
Yeah.
think the biggest technique difference was bucking up to weight classes? Because like speed and strength are obviously different, but um, what else? Like, was it on the feet? Was there? I went from 197 to heavyweight, so I know what my answer would be that. But that's a little bit of a different shift than 157 to 74.
Yeah, I think it's probably gonna be similar to what you went through, but, like, I just thought there was a little bit, less room for error in terms of the attacks I was taking. Like, I can't just take a 80% good shot and just figure it out from there, where I felt like at 57, like, if I got on the legs and it wasn't a perfect shot, I could make something work from there. At 74, if I was attacking and felt a little bit undersized compared to some of the guys, like you don't take as many of those attacks. And so I think the pace slowed down a little bit. I was a little bit more selective with some of the shots that I would take. Um, and so I would say my scoring was still high. It's just I was a little bit more conscious of the shots that I was taking, comparatively to a 57, where sometimes you just unload the clip and whatever happens, happens. Where it was like, I don't know if I'm willing to, push this one position if I don't have to be. And so I think that was a little bit of a change technically. But I think knowing that too, like my defense for sure got a whole lot better. Just because I knew that if I was feeling this way against these guys, I'm sure they're going to feel the same way too. And so I just didn't really ever give them a great opportunity to score. That was the ideal situation. And so I felt like my reattacks got a ton better because you were starting to recognize like, hey, this shot maybe isn't that great. I got to capitalize here. So that was a change. I would say there wasn't a ton different. I mean, there was some fear though. I remember the first match that I wrestled at 74. We were wrestling like a dual meet against West Virginia, and I still hadn't wrestled at that weight before. Um, and so when I had like a little bit of self-doubt beginning, I was like, man, what if I did all this and I just went out there and it was a complete mess? Like it was like, what if there was a huge change in my wrestling because I did this? and I went out and teched the guy. And then after that, I
Yep.
didn't have that feeling again. And so it's just like, there were some changes for sure. I don't think it was like a huge difference, but there were some nuances there that, made the wrestling a little different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that totally
That's
makes
so
sense.
cool. I also think, man, and we're kind of jumping all over the place. We're going to start with kind of your start, but let's get into it right now with you talking about jumping up too to kind of be close to your brother. What was that experience like, wrestling with your brother in college? Because I was around, two brothers at Northwestern, Andrew and Luke Davison. And it was such a cool, like, I was just thinking about it, like, it's such a cool, unique opportunity to be through, like, going through, um, a college season with your brother, and how did that start, I guess, from the beginning? Did you guys start wrestling around the same time? And how has that like shaped your wrestling experience, I guess, being around him?
Yeah, I would say it's been a huge the biggest impact in my wrestling career has been my brother for sure. And I would think that, it's probably the same for him as well. And so we've mutually benefited from the fact that we've gotten to spend our careers together, or for the most part. So I'm 2 years older than him. I started wrestling when I was 6. And then once I got into the sport, my family had never done wrestling before. Nobody really had ever done it. And so I kind of came out of the blue. But once my dad, and my mom as well, they figured like if I was going to do this, like Trent was going to do it as well. So after the first year that I wrestled, Trent joined the next year with me. And for me, it was it was a natural progression. Like I became good from the start. And I think like my work ethic qualities and just overall natural athleticism helped propel me at an early age, and it became very natural for me. And for Trent, it was actually a little bit different. Like he struggled at first in terms of like understanding the rules, and also like losing to another person. Like that was a huge struggle for him to deal with. Like, so if he lost, like there'd be huge temper tantrums. And like for me, I was a little bit more even keeled at that point and could just kind of move on from it, where he was just, you know, can't deal with this. And so as time went on, like he became, even like more maniacal about the pursuit of it. And he worked incredibly hard. Um, but that was kind of after like learning how to deal with losses, and like learning what like hard work in wrestling meant. Um, because he was just very naturally athletic and great at a lot of sports. And so wrestling was very hard for him to kind of figure out in terms of like the mental side of it. And so I would say about like after junior high, he really, really figured all that out. And instead of like giving half effort into wrestling, because he's like good at a lot of other things, he went all in on wrestling. And that was kind of when I would say the two of our careers really started to pick up. Just we had each other, we're right around the same weight this whole time throughout high school, made each other a lot better. And I think having our two very different personalities, made us quite a bit better as well. And so that kind of led into college. And once I got myself established at NC State, Trent joined. And then it kind of like, I feel like in college, it almost flipped a little bit. Like growing up, I was always trying to set a really great example for him and have him follow me. And then we get to college, and like watching him, prepare and compete, it was almost like like, oh wow, like this guy is out doing what I'm doing right now. And like, I need to follow his lead. And so it's like, I think whenever you have brothers, especially like a lot of the times, like the younger brother outdoes a lot of what the older brother does, just because they are able to kind of look at them and see, you know, I've got something to prove. And like for him, he really outdid a lot of what I was able to do. And so like that was motivating for me to be around somebody like that. And I would say our college careers, like we got so much out of each other with that. and it never had to be something like where it was like a sibling rivalry. It was just like we made each other so much better. And we always, it wasn't always like this from the start, but we got really good at compartmentalizing like, hey, what happens in practice, like with each other, it stays in practice. And then we have a different thing outside of this. The moment that we got really good at that in high school, I think we were able to show up to practice and either beat the shit out of each other or like challenge each other if we weren't wrestling each other. And then once practice was over, it was, we were really close and, did everything together. So we mutually benefited a lot from having each other around. And like during my career, he was one of my coaches. Like I was one of his coaches. And so, you look at the guys you have on staff that are supporting you a lot. And like I always had an extra eyes on me and an extra perspective that knew me better than, everybody else. And so that is an underlooked quality. I think that I'm really grateful for in my career.
Yeah, that's such a cool, opportunity, and I bet there's been some brawls between you 2 growing up. How did you guys learn to compartmentalize that? Because I mean, just everybody here has seen, a bunch of fights, maybe been in some fights in wrestling rooms, and it's, like,
Mhm.
that much more heightened when it's your freaking brother, you know? So, was that trial and error, or did you one day, like, have a sit down and you guys like, "Listen, let's compartmentalize this?" Like, how'd that work?
Well, I think yeah, there's definitely part of that. Like we definitely had to have a sit down and I can get to that. It's like, I think at the start though, our family is so wound to compete and just make competition a normal thing. Like sometimes people, I think families will shy away from having their siblings like compete against each other. So I would say like Trent and I probably like on the record, like on the books, we have like close to 10 matches, like actual
Well,
competitive matches against each other. Um, and so it was always just known from the start where if that happened, like we would wrestle each other and whatever the outcome was, like you deal with it, like you live with it. And so I was always much better at a younger age just because like 2 years of experience at ages 8 through 14 makes a ton of difference. And we were always the same size. And so we would wrestle, from time to time. And I would usually beat up on him and, would beat up on him in terms of like our training and leading up to it. But he was so wired that none of that mattered. Like whenever it was time to compete, like he knew in his head that he should beat me. And so whenever it didn't happen, it was like any other person that he could have wrestled. Like why would I be okay with losing to him? And so like some people would look at that and be like, wow, that's kind of like could produce some toxicity. But with us, like that was such a framework of like our family to compete that was the
mm,
normal thing. And if we did something else, that would produce more drama than anything else. And so I think we got to the point where we had done things very differently. Like we were at sport. He was at the end of junior high, and I was in high school, and I was really looking for him to make that next step up in terms of commitment. And he was fighting it and fighting it, and I think a lot of it had to do with me, just because of I did sit things a certain way, and my parents wanted him to do it that way. And at some point, though, we had to have a conversation of like, man, I don't really care about how you get the work done. Like you can be your own individual and your own personality and do whatever you want to do. Um, make it like have your own personal flair to this. Like you don't have to do what I do and you don't have to compete or act the way that I do. And that really freed him up to become like all in on wrestling. Like he was used his personality. He wore the things he wanted to wear. He, celebrated the way he wanted to celebrate. Like he had fun with it finally and stopped looking at it as a chore and something that I did as well. And then put his own twist to it. And so that really jump started his career and made my career, as a secondary much better too, because having him all in, like that made me way better. And so that was a really big turning point, I think, for us and, making a big jump.
So when did you guys sit down and have a conversation like, hey, we're gonna scrap, especially as he got better and better and that he closed some of that skill gap?
Mhm.
Like, when did you guys have that conversation?
I would say that was probably like whenever I was a freshman in high school and he was in seventh grade. And so he was starting to make that jump up. We were around the same weight training together anyways. Um, but I knew that like what he was doing wasn't sustainable. Like he just looked at this as a chore and something he had to put the time into until like baseball season came around. But I recognized that his talent was like he has a superior talent, and you combine that with like his personality, you can make something really dangerous. And so I really pushed him to like kind of find his own groove. And, once we sat down and kind of talked about that, it definitely had a weight off of his shoulders, like where he could do what he wanted to do. And so that was when he made a big jump. I would say going into his eighth grade year, then, makes the Pennsylvania junior high state finals. And then, at that point, it was off and running for his career. And so that was a big turning point. And I think too, it's like you're dealing with teenage kids, and that's at that point where he's starting to kind of frame his identity as well. Like as a person, like, you're
Yeah.
dealing with so many, hormones and like crazy things are happening in your lives that like you just mash up like with, a wrestling career that, could very well really take off if you take it seriously. And so that was a big turning point, not only for a lot of teenagers, you start to form kind of your identity then, but for him and I especially.
Did you guys, I'm going to guess the answers now, but because I coach two brothers, they're probably the best kids on the team I coach, same age difference. Sometimes there's like too much respect, especially in live. Like they drilled super well, they play wrestle super well, but when the time to like scrap, there's like just like this layer of respect that you might not have for just like a teammate or someone else, an opponent. Did you guys ever have that, or was it always just like gloves off when you come?
Yeah, I I would say like that's really common. It's kind of weird with two brothers. I feel like it's either ends of the extreme. Like they either go all out and they don't really care, like they don't even know what points are being scored, but they just want to win. And then there's like way too much respect, like in what your case is. And so I would say Trent and I were on the other end of the extreme. But I would say that it was lopsided at first, like in favor of me. Like I was just much better, and older. And then as time went on, the gap really like shortened down. Um, and it wasn't like too much respect. It's just like we knew everything that we were trying to do, and it was really hard to score on each other. And then he just got really good. And then it's now on the other end of the spectrum where it's like if I don't put together like a really good wrestling match, like I'm going to get my ass kicked. And so like the tables have turned, and it's kind of it's funny how stories work out that way. Um but I think like the biggest thing you got to get over is the like doubt in your head of kicking your brother's ass. Like that has to be thrown out the window. And it's easier for me to say because I've been on both ends of it. Like I had my time where I had to do that to Trent, and I think it made him tougher. Um, and then he's at the point now where if I had to wrestle him, it would be, you know, really bad news probably on my end. But I think you've got to really get over that mental block of, you know, administering some pain to somebody that you spend so much time with.
I think that's super cool, man. Especially too, like I'm a younger brother, and it is like such a like funny mindset growing up where you're like chasing your brother and wanting to like do everything they're doing. And so like being able to like open up and lead him down the right path and do that with like the character that you have is really cool. And I think that it's a special quality. I felt that way about my brother too, where it's like if I was in my brother's shoes growing up, I would 100% have been like, hey man, like get out of my hair. Like what's my little brother doing here? And it's same kind of like 2 year gap. Um, but I do think also kind of going back to NC State, like you were kind of guiding you're starting you're going to college first, you're going to high school first, you're going to middle school first. How'd you choose NC State? And then obviously great deal for NC State because it ended up being a package deal with your brother. Did you guys always know it was going to be that way, or was it like, I mean, you guys just couldn't see yourself being in a different spot? And yeah, how did you find your way to NC State versus other programs?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like the recruiting processes for Trent and I looked a lot different. I actually kind of knew all along that NC State was the best fit for me. It just
Mhm.
made a lot of sense. Like it was, you know, 7 hours from home, which was like, you're experiencing something really new. But also like I'm not too far. And then also like just the mentality of the coaches and the guys in the team, like it just was right what I needed. They were kind of really growing at that point and started to bring together really good recruiting classes. And their big sell for me was just leadership. Like I would be able to come into NC State and usher in a new era for them and, take them from a team that's getting really good to it's going to be a team that's really good, you know, every year, year in, year out. And so it was an easy sell for me. I was all in on it. And then for Trent, his recruiting process was much longer. He was really good at this time in junior, senior year of high school and was getting recruited by everybody. And actually, like I had some fear at from time to time just because our relationship was, predicated on, leaning into what makes individual great and not having to do what I did, and not having to follow that path. And so there were like some times where I was like, man, he might actually just go do his own thing, which I would have been completely happy for him. And so it kind of went on pretty long and he had it down to Iowa and NC State. And like Iowa made a huge push for him. And I was like, I could actually see this like being a place where he would lean into just because it's like kind of an against the grain like choice. Like people would have been like, oh, like, wow, this guy's going there, like, and not the NC State. But I think like it all ended up working out. Like he came to NC State for his own reasons and to make his own story and not just like be a part of whatever I was doing. And so we talked a good bit about that. And I think it all worked out for the best. Like he came to NC State and wrote his own story, one that stands, far and away on his own and better than mine. And so it all ended up working out, but it was a little bit touch and go there for a brief second.
What about, because NC State and Coach Papalizia are, known for kind of a great culture, very serious buy-in from the athletes. Talk about that a little bit and what that was like, and why you like that kind of more straight edge hardcore culture.
Yeah. I think for me personally, like I'm the first to admit, like, hey, this might not be for you. Like, if somebody is like, yeah, I don't know if I want these like high standards on everything that I do, or like if you mess up and you're somebody that's not doing the right things, like, and you don't want to be held like to a high level of accountability, like that's probably not the place for you to go. But I think a lot of us lean into that. And once we're there, it's like, hey, this is what we signed up for. Like, we didn't sign up, but like whenever the first weekend of school year comes around, like you're out at frat parties and like then next week preseason starts and it's like, oh, it's all good. Like that's what we knew going into the recruiting process. And whenever you're there, the guys that are able to tell themselves, hey, this is what I signed up for, like those are the guys that do great. The guys that fight it and are like, hey, like I'm a college age kid, like I'm being held to these crazy high standards. Like maybe you weren't like listening in all that much on what was sold to you in the recruiting process. And so I look at it as like there's not a one set way of you know, what a way a college program should operate. It's different for everybody and everybody has a different fit. I just knew for me that like I could go to a place where, accountability was high and standards were high. And I feel like I thrived in that environment. Um, and whenever you have a couple of guys on the team that are really spearheading that, then you start to bring up a ton of guys. And so I think that's what has made NC State great in the past 10 years is you have, you know, you've always got a core of guys that are living this lifestyle. And next thing you know, you have these kind of unheralded, maybe under the radar recruits that follow along with them. Um, just because like, hey, like I'm here, like why should I make an excuse for why I'm not doing great? Like all these other guys are buying in, I'm buying in, like I want to follow along and reap the benefits of it too. And so I think that was kind of the culture. But yeah, it's high standards at times. Like we're gonna do some workouts where like you're gonna question your own toughness level. But I never felt like it was out of control where like we were just working hard just to say we did. Like I think everything was for a reason. And there's also a lot of, really high end um, coaching and overall strategy involved in that program as well. Like you don't grow a fan base like that and you don't grow your, overall program culture without people having a really thought out and detailed plan for what's going on. So yeah, a lot of times people will bring up the culture and be like, wow, they're expected to do a lot. But also I think it's presented in a way where like that's what we signed up for. And also if you go there and you fail, like there's also people there that are going to pick you up and bring you into the next phase too. Like it was never like, oh yeah, NC State culture. Like if you don't show up and do the right things and you're not following along, like you're just going to be like kind of left out to the curb. Like there's a lot of instances where like whenever you have such a high demand and high performance level, like there's going to be times when you falter. And it happened to me plenty of times, like where I needed to be picked up by my team and by my coaches. And that's to me is the sign of a great culture.
What do you think, for our listeners that don't know, like what were some of the more remarkable culture centerpieces or standards that you guys were asked to adhere to and buy
Um,
into?
yeah. So, I mean, the no drinking, no tolerance policy is one that kind of gets brought up a lot. And at the end of the day, like, I think it's so big for those guys that come into college. Like, that's that is brought up in recruiting meetings. Like, hey, like, this is a really bad idea for an 18 to 20-year-old kid to ruin their college career or their like life trajectory over doing really dumb things. And so, like, 18 to 20-year-old kids are going to do dumb things regardless. But if you can like at least have a message of like, hey, like we don't want to have any tolerance regarding this. Like I honestly think that's a healthy because you at least took a stance on it. Like I think sometimes people get into such indecision when it comes to that, like where I thought that it was fair that somebody told me this is what is expected. And that's not to say like you go to NC State and like everybody's robots. Like that's not what it is. And we always really enjoyed our time together and like found other ways to, have a great culture without that. And yeah, there's definitely plenty of guys that didn't follow that. But it's like if you at least have a standard and you're chasing that, like I thought that was fair to me. So that's one thing that happened. And there's no way to like perfect that. It's just, I think just the brand that NC State has created, they've kind of become like one of those, this is what a culture looks like. And honestly, it's probably just because of how much it changed. Like a lot of these programs are doing a lot of these things. It's just, there was a ton of change at NC State and you could see the growth that was being made. And, Coach Pop is just a huge culture guy in terms of like, I think the biggest thing there is like, if you're not bought in and you're not providing value, then like, what are we doing here? I think that's something that is a little bit unique to NC State is like, there's plenty of guys there that have had a lot of success in their life that maybe wrestling wasn't even a part of it, but they grew such a huge advantage over some of their peers by being in our program. Like everybody was bought in and that's got to come from the guys that are in the spotlight to the guys that don't share any of that benefit of being on TV or whatever, like there are some guys that I trained with that didn't reap any of the rewards of having the spotlight, and they still put in a lot of the same work that I did. And I think that's where a good culture is in place. Like I think being a, a third string guy in Division 1 wrestling team it's a really hard thing for people to do. But those guys at NC State were killers, and like they made me a ton better. And so I think that's a great culture piece to have as well.
Yeah, that is that is awesome. I mean, it's it is like building a culture is arguably one of the most important. These I think especially with wrestling because it's such a demanding, like high. You ask so much of your athletes that if you have the culture surrounding it, then it's an easier ask. Whereas if you don't have that culture kind of backing up the ask and the level of commitment that you're asking of your athletes, it's really kind of tough. And I've seen it personally on teams I've been on. Like culture is a make or break thing.
Yeah.
It really is.
And I think even moving into now, like the other side of it, the coaching role, like
Yeah, I was
I,
gonna ask that.
it's different. It's different at every place, and a great culture looks different somewhere else. Like these kids all have different experiences. When at the end of the day, as it's much different. Like as an athlete, I had my way of being great. And that doesn't mean that I just have to force that on every guy that I'm coaching. Like now that I'm coaching a team, I look at it as that what is the best way to create value from these guys? Like what is the environment that fosters them to be their best? Not how do I just come up with some like microcosm of a program that just mimics what I did. Because if you
Yeah.
do that, you're just going to create guys who are like at odds with you. As a coach, like that's not what coaching is trying to figure out what made me great and just like shoving it down somebody's throat. It's like, yeah, you bring your personal experience to that. But the first thing that I had to learn as a coach was like, there are so many ways of being great in sport and in life that I have to foster the environment and I have to encourage these kids to figure that out on their own. Like that's part of life is figuring out what makes you great. And like as a coach, sometimes you got to get kids to buy in on that. And so I think culture as a team is a little bit more tricky than like having your own personal culture of what you're trying to do. Like you're trying to juggle a couple of different ways that make people great. And then at the same time, expect a certain standard from an entire team. When in, I think to try to make it as simple as I can, like for me coaching, it's just, I have to bring out the best in each guy in whatever way that is. Okay. I have to somehow find a consistent message to get that out of them, even though it's going to look differently for each guy. So it's difficult. Like that's why it's so difficult to come up with a team culture just because everybody's their own individual and you can't expect everybody to work the same way or behave the same way. Like that's part of coaching is figuring out what makes each person great while at the same time trying to with trying to come up with a team culture that is supportive of those things that are beneficial and not destructive.
Yeah. That's like you can mitigate some of that by trying to like recruit like-minded individuals or the right culture fit. But at the end of the day, it's impossible to like get it all done that
Yeah.
way.
Yep.
I think too, though, like what you're talking about comes from, strong leadership too. I think Pat's a great example of that. Like he set a good example of a great culture. Um, I didn't know too much about you guys, but just like, when we were competing, but just like watching the progression from when you started there to like, I think the last year there was like, we were in the locker room with you guys at nationals. It was sweet. Like we just took over that locker room and we had 10 guys there. You had 10 guys there. It was like cool to see you guys come back and how you guys supported each other after every match. And, um, it was like evident to see that like there was a strong culture there. But I think like you're saying, it takes a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of different personalities. It takes a lot of time to build that. And there's different kinds of things that work better for different individuals. Um, But I guess going back to kind of your personal training and stuff like that, how did your mindset around wrestling change throughout that arc of, going from, coming from high school into college, and then you get to a point where you're like, hey, I'm going to go up a couple weight classes. Like, how did you think about your training throughout the week, and how has that impacted how you coach?
Yeah, I think looking back and into trying to like pinpoint like my training and what made me great wrestling is a little bit hard, but I think if I try to simplify it, it's I always strived to be very well rounded, and make my wrestling free from like making huge errors. And so like kind of looking at my wrestling, like always kept pretty good position. That was always a big strength of mine. And I did have, one thing that I was really great at. Like I had a certain position that I would consider myself like very master class at doing. And so,
Yeah, every time we wrestled, I'm like, I gotta keep this right hand in. Don't let him get an underhook.
yeah. And so like that can take you pretty far. Like I would always try to come up with in my head, like, you know, you can't be a jack of all trades and a master of none. Like you've got to have some level of mastery in something that separates you from other people. But then that doesn't mean that you can just like be a one trick pony either. Like you got to have some base of really functional wrestling and functional athleticism. But then you also got to be able to separate yourself in some way. And so I think a lot of my training tried to, promote that statement internally of like, you can't be a jack of all trades and a master of none. Like I always tried to master and, be really great at the underhook position and everything that comes with that. But a lot of times people don't look at like, in order for me to get there and have that mastery, I had to really be great fundamentally. And so when it came to my training, I was just always trying to support those 2 points, like have great defense, have great positioning, like know a very good, um, understanding of the sport, but then also separate myself in one way. And I think it was just, I needed to pick something that supported my overall athleticism strengths and that, just ended up being underhook stuff. And I think the way that my body is structured and where my strengths lie, that was a great place to be. Like I had um, a great gas tank and, very strong upper body, especially. And so I looked at the underhook position as something where, okay, maybe my athleticism is not at some levels of where these other guys are, but the underhook position really negates some of that. And so when it came to my strength training, especially, like I needed to make sure that I could have really flexible shoulders and that I could withstand a ton of pressure being in there. And then also, like, if I'm just conditioning, like, if I'm just going out and going for a run or doing kind of mindless conditioning exercises, like, I'm not utilizing my full potential in these positions that I'm spending a lot of time in a match. Like a lot of trendized conditioning came around like being able to hand fight when you're exhausted. So like you're doing a ton of like handicap, like kind of live goes where I'm really tired and I'm going in on a fresh guy and I've got to be able to hand fight and I've got to be able to keep this guy off my legs and I've got to be able to get to my ties and move forward and things like that. And so I tried to take I wouldn't say like a specialized approach, but I knew that I would be spending a lot of time in underhooks. And so like, why wouldn't I spend a good bit of time strength training, conditioning to make that position even better? Um, and so that kind of helped formulate my game plan in terms of my training. Um, Kept a really good basis and overall knowledge of the sport of wrestling. And um, I didn't want to be like out of my league in any position, but I knew that I had to separate myself and make something special for myself. And so that's kind of where my underhook, you know, came to be. I think it's just as you're going through the sport, you figure out the things you're great at and the things you're not. Um, and I leaned into what I was great at while starting to minimize some of the mistakes on other ends.
What does what does your training look like now as you're a coach, training and nutrition? Like, how do you
Yeah.
transition that part of
A
your
lot
life?
of pickleball. Hey, Hayden's got a nasty slice in pickleball.
Yeah. I think it definitely changes. Like I was so during, whenever I was competing, like everything was heightened to an extent. Like I still love wrestling and I love going in and wrestling live and, you know, going through hard training, but it's much different now. You take a step back and you're looking at more objectives to keep you active and at a point where on any given day, like if I had to go wrestle somebody that's really good in training, I would be able to. Um, but that's a very different training than like getting ready for world team trials as a senior level
Yeah.
athlete or getting ready for the NCAA tournament. That's much different. And so I would say now I give myself quite a bit more grace. Like I don't, I don't find the need for me to over overdo it in any area of life. Um, where I think as a athlete and competitor, sometimes that's good to be so fixated on the pursuit that you might overdo it from time to time. And then you just got to bring yourself back. That's where the best operate. But now as a coach, like I still want to be competitive enough and in shape enough and technically good enough to hammer the guys in the room because they need it. Um, but also myself personally, I've got to give myself a little bit more grace. And I talked about this a little bit with some of my friends and some of the guys that wrestled. And you see sometimes that these guys that finish their careers wrestling, sometimes they'll go to two extreme lengths. Like sometimes they turn into a shell of their former self and like they don't look the way that they looked in college. And then other guys like completely transform themselves and they like are in crazy shape. And I think it comes down to like, for me, I want to find a good balance, and still be very, very healthy. But I look at some of those guys that aren't healthy anymore. And I think they look at wrestling training the way that we were as competitors and feel like if they're not doing that, then like, yeah, why bother? And, think you just have to find a balance from it. And like, I think some guys will look at it as such a huge task and like a mountain to climb where like, oh, I think about the way I was in shape and the way that I was training when I was college wrestling. Then they do like a day or two of it outside of like after that next stage in life. And they're like, I can't do this. And then like their personal like inability to get over that, I think sometimes makes them really unhealthy, people overall. And then they start, getting into worse habits. And so I always wanted my wrestling after my career to find some balance and find some grace. And so like, that's kind of why I'll pick up, like I can play pickleball once a week or something like that where I scale back my strength or wrestling training and then just complement it with things that everyday people can do. And like if you're being a healthy individual, um, yeah, you can, not feel bad about using pickleball as like, yeah, that was my training for the day. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think my mind has shifted a little bit since I've stopped competing kind of on that front.
That's
Yeah, I
awesome.
love
You
that.
found that balance. Yeah, because it is hard. It's like all or nothing, and a lot of people don't choose the all, or and they choose the nothing, and then kind of let themselves go, or go the other way
Yeah.
and go all in. And then, yeah, college wrestling is a pretty, even the senior level athletes figure out like, hey, you got to kind of like pace yourself a little bit here.
Hmm.
It's an extraordinary thing. It's great to do for 5, 6 years. That's probably all you want to do that for. And after that, find
So
some more balance. And it's cool you found that balance.
Hmm.
it is a suicide pace, that kind of training. You can't hold up your whole life for sure. Hayden, I think one of the last things I definitely want to talk to you about is one of the coolest things I think we've talked about before is kind of your like vision for yourself and your brother in the future in the sport of wrestling. Do you want to touch on that really quick? What you think, like what you guys want to ultimately do?
Yeah. So like, I think right now, a theme of this, conversation has sort of been like, leaning into what makes you great and accepting kind of the qualities that you have. And so with my brother and I, we come from, the same house and the same upbringing, but we have two different paths and way of doing it. But I think it complements each other really well. And so right now he's killing it on the senior circuit. Like he's made the national team to third at the Olympic trials. Like he's got a few years in him where he can have such cool international experiences and these experiences that are going to make him like incredible. Like as a coach, he's going to experience all these things and learn how to train at such a high level and compete at a high level. And my story is a little bit different. Like I got into coaching and I want to I want to know what it takes to build up a great culture. And I want to know what it takes to be a great recruiter, a great fundraiser, a great administrator, like those things. And so, you know, not anytime soon. I would like it to be, sort of a 7, 8 year plan. Like I would love to take over a program with him. Um, and utilize our shared experiences. And I think it could make a really great team. And so we're kind of on our separate paths right now, but I know it will in the end converge into something that is, really special. And I think that's been a long-term goal of ours. And I think an important thing whenever you do something like that is you got to appreciate the different experiences that come out of the sport. And in 2 months that I've been at Stanford, I've learned so many different things about how to run a program. Like, and a lot of it has been really beneficial for me and completely new to me. And so I look at my long-term goal overall. It's like, yeah, I'd love to be a head coach, but if you're not pursuing, you know, different avenues and different ways of doing things, like, and throwing yourself in those opportunities, like, I think you're selling yourself short. And so I've really conveyed that message to Trent as well. Just his path is different, but he's the same in terms of like the way that he's shifting his mindset around it. Like he's throwing himself at, you know, going to Hungary on 2 weeks notice and then wrestling Yazdani, like, and throwing himself at these opportunities to go and train different places and compete at different places. Like that's a really beneficial thing to do in life. And so I've been really pushing that for him.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Would love to see a Hidlay 1-2 punch coaching combo one day. And now we got to get Trent on Iron Summit and hear his side of the story. But really appreciate your time today. And we'll get you back on get after you been at Stanford for a few months and
Yeah,
see
for
how your
sure.
coaching
Yeah.
journey.
Thank you guys
Yeah.
so much. It's been a really cool conversation. Like Trent's for sure a guy that you want to have on here. Just he can give you probably even more insight on training, like in terms of like taking yourself to a deep and like dark place training wise, like that's where he thrives. And so like
Love
I think that's always a really good conversation to have because like he thrives in that sort of environment. And if things are bad, it's like he finds a different gear to be able to slip into. And whenever he was able to do that, whenever we were training together, I was always just like, dude, I've got to follow this guy. Like, and so
Awesome.
it to have that mindset and be somebody that's just able to do it. Like, I think that's a really beneficial tool to have. And so, yeah, I'll definitely push for him to get on here and that'll be a cool story.
Thank you, Hayden. Appreciate you, man. This has been awesome. It's been great getting to know you. And yeah, dude, you made me a better competitor. I'm excited to see you have a huge impact at Stanford. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, maybe part two, we can just dissect all of our matches we had against each other. And
I like that.